Hello, welcome back to the channel and welcome to the first new drill which has been created by Hackmotion. Well, actually it's been created by me, but it's been created by the knowledge I've been given by Hackmotion. One of the wonderful things in my job is that I'm always learning as well, and I'm trying to take the new information that I'm getting from devices like Hackmotion and then turn that into simple drills, simple exercises that my students can do to play better golf. Now, what is it again that Hackmotion is showing us? Well, it's basically showing us the change in the wrist's angle to the ball relative to its starting position. And we measure this in what we call extension, the bending up of the wrist, flexion, the bending down of the wrist, ulnar deviation, that's the tilting down of the wrist, the hinging down of the wrist, and radial deviation, the tilting up of the wrist, and obviously also rotation. Now, I've been thinking a lot about how to explain this to you. Should we be talking about bowing or cupping, hinging? In the end, I think probably it's simpler if we just use the right terminology for the movements, and unfortunately it's something you're going to have to get used to. I know that it will get you, a few of you kind of having to watch this more than once, but that will help my analytics for the YouTube channel. So once you get used to it, I'll be using the same terminology all the time. When we look at good golfers, what we do see on all good golfers is they get into more or less the same position at impact. Some of them with more rotation, some of them with less rotation. If you're looking at the lead wrist, almost always you've got a bit of flexion there. And the guys and girls at Hackmotion are basically telling us you're going to have somewhere between kind of 3 and 10 degrees of flexion in your wrist at impact. However, at the address position, you're probably going to have a certain amount of extension. Because of the way we actually grip a golf club, there is actually a slight extension in the wrist in the address position. And that could be anything from around about kind of 20-25 degrees of extension. So if you've got a wrist which has 25 degrees of extension in the address position and should have 7 degrees of flexion at impact, you've got a change of 32 degrees. And that means that you're taking your golf club, which was absolutely square, hopefully, at the address position, and then you are actually going to bend your wrist back and change the loft and the direction of the golf club. It's actually going to be pointing to the left of the target and down into the ground. So something must be happening with your trail hand to actually get that back to square. And what's actually happening with your trail arm and hand is because you're getting this kind of throwing action, your trail arm and hand is actually going to be bent back. So you're actually going to have more extension in the trail wrist at impact, and you're going to have more bend in the trail elbow at impact, which is opening the club face. And the amount that the trail arm is opening the club face and the lead arm is closing the club face should bring you back to a square position. Now, obviously that's a very, very simplified idea because the rotation of your body will also have an impact on the face angle. The deviation, that means the light change of the club, will have an impact on the face angle. But just to keep it simple and to get to actually practicing it, let's just think about kind of the changes in what's going to happen with the lead arm primarily, because that's what the Hackmotion is measuring. So I have a change or need a change in my wrist angle from address to impact of around about 30 degrees. This will obviously depend on the grip that you have. If you have a weaker grip, you will actually have less flexion. If you have a stronger grip, you will actually have more flexion. But what are the drills that you've got to do and how do you understand them? I think one of the big dangers when you're just talking about one measurement of one joint is to think that by manipulating that joint, you are actually going to be able to control the swing. And because the golf swing is a chain reaction, obviously what's happening in this joint is going to have a lot to do with what's happened in the joints before it. Even to the extent that how your feet are working will eventually kind of through a chain reaction get to the last link in the chain and have an influence about what your hands are doing. So there is no way that we can just find a drill here which is going to cure all of your problems in the golf swing. However, what I am finding is by getting a better understanding of how the lead arm works or should be working in a golf swing will actually help you to cure a lot of the problems that you might be having in your golf swing, especially problems with the shallowing of the golf club, flattening out of the golf club in the downswing, especially problems with face angle and especially problems with impact. Getting a good strike on the golf ball will all be helped by having a better understanding of how your lead arm should be working when you're swinging a golf club. And that's basically what I want to show you today. How does the lead arm work and how can you train the lead arm to work correctly? The first thing to understand is that although in the end it's going to be a change in the angles that you have in your lead wrist, it's going to have an effect, or it's going to be dependent on what is happening with the entire arm from the shoulder joint down to the wrist joint. So let's just have a quick look. If I go into the address position, you can see here that I have a certain amount of bowing or cupping rather in the wrist, a little bit of extension in the wrist here. So if I actually look at that now, I've got around 19, 20 degrees of extension in this wrist. If I look further up the arm, the lower arm is actually rotated in a kind of a clockwise direction away from the target. You can see that simply because the lead thumb is actually on the right side of the shaft rather than on the left side of the shaft. The upper arm, however, is actually rotated in the other direction. So I actually have rotation with the upper arm in an anti-clockwise direction, the lower arm in a clockwise direction, and then I have flexion in the wrist. So these are the angles that we are given or setting up in the address position. If I go into impact, I have the feeling that the upper arm is even more rotated to virtually to the end of its range of movement. The lower arm is rotated back away from the target as it was in the address position, and the wrist is not only higher, but it's slightly bowed back. So the upper arm is basically going to remain and then go into even more rotation towards the target in an anti-clockwise direction. The lower arm is going to remain rotated away from the target in a clockwise direction, and your wrist is going to go from extension to flexion. So how in the world are you going to actually practice this? Well, I think the very first thing you've got to do is actually get a feeling for what the arm is actually doing. So if you just straighten your arm out in front of yourself and then hold your upper arm and actually physically rotate it as far as you can in an anti-clockwise direction, then normally, automatically, your lower arm and your hand will go with it. Then what I want you to do is just rotate your lower arm and your hand back, but keep your upper arm where it was. So you have to hold it quite tightly to do that, but you will actually see the range of movement you have in your upper arm and the range of movement you have independently of your upper arm with your lower arm. And you can see then you can also kind of hinge the wrist back as well. So when we're taking the address position, consciously or unconsciously, this is happening. In the majority of good address positions, the elbow of the player is actually pointing slightly down and in towards more kind of the lead hip than it is pointing outwards towards the target. Obviously, having this position is more likely to cause you a little bit of a chicken wing, and it will also cause what we call internal rotation here in the shoulder joint. So When I actually start in this position, in my address position, with the upper arm rotated out towards the target, the lower arm away from the target, and the wrist hinged back, what's going to happen with them during the swing? So as I actually take the club away from the ball and away from the target, you can actually say that this lead elbow is still pointing down, and the lead shoulder is staying in more or less the same position. This is one of the reasons that your club is being lifted up in front of your body and is staying over the original shaft plane. As you start to hinge the wrists though, and especially the trail wrist and elbow, then you are starting to rotate the wrist at the same time as the lower arm, but the upper arm should be staying relatively passive here. And it's only when you start to really pull the club up behind you with your trail elbow that your upper shoulder or your lead shoulder goes into internal rotation, and there will be a little bit of clockwise rotation here in the lead arm. That will turn the elbow a little bit outside, but I don't think it's a bad thing to resist this a little bit and have the feeling that your lead elbow is still pointing more or less at the ground. It won't be, but that will be the kind of feeling. When we start the downswing then, as you start with your lower body to change direction, the weight of the club is going to resist this, and to a certain extent it's going to hold the lead shoulder in internal rotation. So it's rotated up here. This is the feeling that your chin is on your upper shoulder here. But what we need you to do is to get this upper arm back where it was to begin with. So although I definitely want you to be starting with your legs, I want you to have the feeling that immediately afterwards you are pulling with your shoulder, not with your wrist, not with your lower arm. With your shoulder, you're pulling the lead shoulder back into its original position, rotating the lead elbow back down towards your lead hip, while at the same time allowing your lower arm to stay rotated and even to rotate more in a clockwise direction. This will be helped by the weight of the club. In fact, if you want to get a better feeling from this, just getting a TheraBand, hanging it from the wall and pulling on the TheraBand. So by pulling the lead shoulder back into its socket, back into an external rotation, getting this lead elbow to rotate down, but at the same time keeping your lead hand held back, you will actually find that the lower arm will rotate clockwise to enable this. Your lead wrist will also start to go into flexion, simply because the weight of the club is causing it to. And as you then rotate into impact and start to extend the trail arm, the lead wrist is staying in flexion because this lead shoulder is being pulled up and away from the ball, which if you were to imagine that you cut my hand off, then is going to pull up and forward this joint towards the target, causing the inertia of the golf club to basically bow the wrist back. In fact, if I were to keep the wrist totally loose and just move the lower arm forward, you can see that the weight of the hand alone will tend to make it go into flexion. So the drill you want to be doing is this feeling as you start your backswing of lifting your lead arm with the elbow pointing towards the ground. Then as you get to around about kind of the beginning of your chest, where your rib cage begin, at that height you want to have the feeling of rotating the lower arm clockwise, and at the same time bowing the wrist back into your feeling into a neutral kind of position at the top. As you start the downswing, you want the feeling of pulling, first of all, the shoulder joint back down and rotating the elbow back down towards the ground and towards your lead hip, while at the same time rotating your lead wrist in a clockwise direction and going into flexion with the lead wrist so that you come around, and at impact you have this feeling of being there. This again is obviously, that's an extreme movement. You're never going to be here. But this is basically just to give your body a feeling of what it should be doing. You can then get this movement to become a little bit more intuitive. This will have the feeling that you're actually kind of doing a slight kind of bowing movement. You're kind of taking the club back outside the line, and you're feeling and then pulling it around and bringing it back inside the line. You've got a lot of work being done by this shoulder joint here, which is lifting, rotating inwards, and then rotating outwards and pulling through. And this is going to help you to generate some speed, because the lead shoulder is pulling up and back. It will accelerate, obviously, the entire arm. So it's not just the rotation of the body which is helping you to accelerate the lead arm, it's also the muscles in your upper shoulder, in your lead shoulder, which are pulling back, pulling the lead arm back into its socket and accelerating the arm down towards the ball, which means that your arms are active at the beginning of the downswing. However, it is your lead arm which is active rather than your trail arm. And your lower lead arm and hand are passive at that stage in the swing. So this change. So you can actually see, hopefully, that happening in the swing. Here I'm lifting the club up in front of me, hinging the heel, the trail hand and an elbow, and pulling the lead arm into internal rotation. I'm then changing direction, pulling down in that I pull the lead shoulder back where it was before, get this lead elbow towards me, but at the same time allow the lower arm to rotate in the opposite direction. And then as I go into extension with the legs, I go into extension shortly afterwards with the trail arm, and that basically is where the release is actually happening in the golf swing. Whether you can actually see that in the swing is another question. And as you can see from that ball flight, thinking about it and doing it at the same time is extremely difficult. But again, it's all about drilling your arms to do the right thing without a ball, then with a golf club. So you're getting the feeling that it's doing the same thing with a club that it was doing without a club, and then put a ball in the way. And in no time whatsoever, you're gonna actually get yourself some flexion going on at impact. I know this was another very complicated movement, another complicated video for you to understand, but I'm pretty sure you're gonna see some pretty great changes in your golf swing if you can master this movement. I'll be back with more next time. Until then, thanks to all of my patrons. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. We'll see you soon.